about the form, the style, and the themes of the Qur'an, and then inshallah begin on the compilation of the Qur'an. So the smallest division of the Quranic text is called an ayah. Ayah means literally a sign. 6,236 ayat in the Qur'an. Denffer makes a comment here that the term verse is not appropriate since the Qur'an is not poetry. But for lack of a better term, we can refer to it as a verse. So that's okay. But many of the ulama prefer not to call it a verse because verse in Arabic is bait, abiyat. In the Quran, they're not abiyat. The Quran is not poetry. وَمَا عَلَّمْنَاهُ شِعْرًا وَمَا يَنبَغِي لَهُ. The Quran explicitly repudiates itself as being poetry. It's not poetry. Right? And we'll talk about what the Quran actually is. It's a form of Arabic prose. So there's two literary genres that are prevalent at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. One is called nathar, nun thara, nathar, which is prose. That's what the Quran is. And there's different types of prose: mursal, straight prose; saja, rhymed prose. Prose is non-metrical. So we'll talk about that later. And then there's something called shi'r, which is poetry. The Quran is not poetry, so the poet has license to myth make. The sha'ir, right? He doesn't have to stay true to history. He can invent stories to teach a true lesson. The ibrah is important. The Quran is not myth-making. The stories in the Quran are true. You know, the flood, the Exodus, right? The story of Adam and Eve. We believe these stories are true. Inna hada lahwa al-qasas al-haq. These stories are true. The poet can invent stories to teach a lesson. The poet also has license to break rules of grammar for the sake of the rhyme, for the sake of the qafiyah. So one of the greatest poets of pre-Islamic Arabia, who actually became Muslim, Labid, he said, "Ala kullu shay'in ma khala Allah batilu." So it should be batilun. You should have put a tanween at the end. But he said batilu for the sake of the rhyme. That's okay, he's a poet, he can do that. The Quran does not break any rules of grammar. It's consistent within itself grammatically. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the tahaddi. The Quran issues a tahaddi. Tahaddi means a challenge. And it's an open challenge, an objective challenge, not subjective. When most Muslims are asked, what is the challenge of the Quran? They say, well, to produce one surah like the Quran. We say, well, what does that mean, one surah like the Quran? Something as beautiful as the Quran. So that's not the challenge. That's very subjective. You can read Arabic poetry that's very beautiful. That's not the challenge of the Quran. The challenge of the Quran is objective. We'll talk more about that, inshallah. So 6,236 ayat. We'll call them verses, for lack of a better term. And then there's 114 surah. Surah means like a fence, surah, or fasl. In the Bible, they're called fasl. Quran calls them surah. The shortest is 3 ayat, 108 surah. Surah 108, Kawthar, is 3 ayat. It's the shortest surah. The longest surah is 286 ayat, Surah Al-Baqarah. What's also noteworthy is the term ayah and surah is in the Quran itself. تِلْكَ آيَاتُ الْكِتَابِ الْمُبِينِ وَإِن كُنْتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ مِمَّا نَزَّلْنَا عَلَى عَبْدِنَا فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِثْلِهِ وَادْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُمْ. So these terms are in the Quran. The term Quran is in the Quran. Ar-Rahman 'allama al-Quran, khalaqa al-insan. Right? So these terms are Qur'anic. All of the surahs, all of the surah, the plural of surah is surah, begin with the basmala, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, except Surah At-Tawbah, surah number 9. And there's two reasons for this according to the ulama. Wallahu a'lam. There is an opinion that Surah At-Tawbah is actually a continuation of the previous surah, Al-Anfal. And that there's really 113 surahs of the Quran. Because if you look at the first few surah, they're extremely long, right? This is how books were pretty much arranged in the pre-modern world, longest to shortest, like the Bible is like that, longest books to the shortest. The Talmud is like that. So Baqarah 286 ayat, Ali Imran 200, An-Nisa 176, Al-Ma'idah 120, An'am 165, Al-A'raf 200, then you have Anfal only 75, and then Tawbah 129. So there's an opinion that these are actually the same surah, which would make 204 ayat, because the theme is the same. You know, Anfal is the major theme is spoils of war, and Surah Tawbah is dealing with rules of engagement in war. That's one opinion, not a very popular opinion. The more popular opinion is that Surah Tawbah lacks the Basmalah, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this surah, He means business. That's it. The Surah Tawbah. If all you had of the Quran was Surah Tawbah, then you'd have a very strange perception of the message of Islam. Surah Tawbah is dealing with rules of engagement. How to deal with khiyana, for example, treachery against the Muslim polity. Right? So there's no basmalah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to stress His majestic qualities. Right? His qualities of rigor. Allahu a'lam. The names of the surahs are often derived from important or distinguishing characteristics or themes within the surah. So Surah Al-Baqarah is called Al-Baqarah because the story is that Musa alayhi salam ordered the Bani Israel to slaughter the Baqarah. And then instead of immediately obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they began asking a series of questions. You know, how old, what color, what is a Baqarah? You know, all these different types of questions. So the ibrah is to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is important because complete faith entails total submission. Right? Even if it seems like it's something that's beyond our intellect, something supra-rational, not irrational. You don't have to believe in anything irrational, anything that can be falsified. You don't have to believe in that. But when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, Subhana alladhi asra bi 'abdihi, that He took His servant on a journey by night from Masjid al-Haram to Aqsa, we don't sit there and try to rationalize it. Well, you know, maybe there was some warp in the space-time continuum or something like that. Allahu a'lam, maybe there's some rational explanation for it. But sami'na wa ta'ana, we hear and we obey. It's a super-rational transmission that's given in text, in scripture. Right? So, id'an and qabul need to be there as part of faith. Id'an in Arabic means submissiveness, and qabul means to accept. Id'an and qabul. So this is why shaitan is a kafir. Shaitan certainly knows that the Prophet ﷺ is a messenger of God. He certainly knows that. Ibn Kathir mentions that when the Prophet ﷺ was born, shaitan started screaming. Why is he screaming? Because he knows that the Prophet ﷺ is the messenger of God. He's accepted the rational proposition that the Prophet ﷺ is a messenger of God. But he's not a Muslim because he doesn't have id'an and qabul of the Prophet ﷺ. There's a difference. Heraclius, the emperor of Byzantium, he interrogated Abu Sufyan ibn Harb. And Heraclius was sort of a freelance biblical scholar, if you will. He was the emperor of Byzantium. So he said to Abu Sufyan, you know, describe him to me. And Abu Sufyan describes him. And then Heraclius says to him, you know he's a prophet. You know he's a prophet. So you should follow him. And he says, soon my dominion will be underneath his feet. This is what Heraclius said to Abu Sufyan. But Heraclius did not become Muslim. Because no id'an and no qabul. He didn't go to Medina and seek out the Prophet, make bay'ah to the Prophet, begin following the Sharia, implementing the Sunnah. None of these things happened. Right? So complete faith entails submissiveness and acceptance. Allah says in the Quran, فَلَا وَرَبِّكَ لَا يُؤْمِنُونَ حَتَّى يُحَكِّمُوكَ فِي مَا شَجَرَ بَيْنَهُمْ ثُمَّ لَا يَجِدُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَرَجًا مِمَّا قَضَيْتَ وَيُسَلِّمُوا تَسْلِيمًا. By your Lord, they don't really believe unless they make you a judge in all of their affairs and they find no resistance in their hearts against your judgments and they have total taslim to you. Total taslim. So this is part and parcel of faith. So Baqarah, some people, why is it called the heifer, the cow? Well, the lesson there is total submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you have surah, some surahs have multiple names. Surah Al-Ikhlas, according to Fakhruddin al-Razi, has 22 names. Sometimes it's just called Qul Huwallahu Ahad. The Prophet ﷺ referred to it as Qul Huwallahu Ahad. He said, Qul Huwallahu Ahad, ta'adilu thuluth al-Qur'an. This surah has the weight of a third of the Qur'an. But it's also called, according to the Sahaba and the Tabi'in, Surah Al-Asas. Surah Al-Asas. Asas means the foundation. And the foundation of theology. It's also called Surah Al-Ikhlas. Ikhlas, of sincerity. It's also called Surah At-Tawheed, the Surah of monotheism or oneness. These are just some of the names of the surah. And then you have a juz, and the plural is ajza'un, ajza'. This is 1/30 of the Qur'an. One out of 30 parts of the Qur'an is called a juz. So the Qur'an is divided into 30 equal parts. This is post-Uthmanic, after the time of Sayyidina Uthman. And this was done for Ramadan recitation, that it's traditional to read a little over one juz a night. It takes about an hour. And then you have a manzil. A manzil is 1/7 of the Qur'an. Also a post-Uthmanic division. So juz and manzil are not mentioned in the Qur'an, but ayah and surah are mentioned. So 7 parts of approximately equal length. So each manzil contains about 4 ajza. Right? And these are sort of divisions that the early scholars developed in order to facilitate hifz of the Qur'an, basically. The language of the Qur'an is Arabic, obviously. May not be so obvious for some Western scholars who claim that the Qur'an is in Syriac. Very strange, sort of radical revisionist opinion. There's a German scholar named Christoph Luxemburg, and that's his pseudonym. It's not his actual name because he's afraid like Muslims are going to kill him or something. But his claim is that, and no one takes him seriously, but his claim is the Qur'an is written in Syriac, is a Syriac text written in Arabic letters. But nobody takes his opinion seriously, as I said. Even someone like Patricia Crone, who believes the text of the Qur'an is totally unreliable, she doesn't take Luxemburg seriously at all. The Qur'an describes itself as Arabiyyun Mubin. So Mubin does not mean that the Qur'an does not contain foreign words. It does contain foreign words. Sometimes anti-Muslim polemicists, they'll say, look, Mubin means, pure, unadulterated Arabic. That's not what Mubin means. It's interesting, you have these satellite stations, and you have these sort of Persian channels, and some of these Iranian guys are totally anti-Muslim. And one of them actually, and he talks about politics, one of them has a rule, if you call my show, you can't use any Arabic. Right? He doesn't like Arabic. So if you call and you say, Salaam alaikum, he'll hang up on you. You have to say, Durud bar shalom. And then he'll say, so no Arabic. Then he starts talking, and he's like, Taklife ma darin dunya. Everything he's saying is Arabic. He doesn't know it's Arabic. Half of what he's saying is Arabic. Anyway, so what does Mubin mean? Arabiyyun Mubin. It means Arabic which reveals clear truth. Mubin is from Abana Yubinu, form 4, in order to make something clear. This is Arabic that demystifies things, that makes it clear. It doesn't mean that it's pure Arabic and there's no foreign words. That's impossible for any language that is a living, breathing language to stay pure. Right? If you go into the English dictionary, into the Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll be amazed what you find in these dictionaries. You'll find the word alcohol, which is Arabic. You'll find algebra. You'll find jihad. You'll find fatwa. These are English words. You don't have to italicize them in academic papers. If you write the word fatwa, you can leave it unitalicized because it's an English word and there's an assumption that the reader knows what it means. Right? Oftentimes they don't know what it means though. They think it means like a death sentence or something. It just means a legal ruling. Most fatwas have to do with food. Can I eat gelatin? Let me see if I can get a fatwa. So the Quran contains, and this is, Imam At-Tabari, Al-Baqilani, Imam Suyuti wrote a short treatise called Al-Mutawakkili, where he says there are 118 expressions in the Quran that contain foreign words. And that these words were used by the Arabs prior to the Quranic revelation, according to Imam Shafi'i. For example, and there's 6 different languages in the Quran. The Quran borrows from 6 or 7 different languages. So the word Injil, for example, Injil is a Greek word. It's Arabicized. The Arabs were using it, so it's Arabic. If you study the Ajrumiyya, Al-Kalamu, وَاللَّفْظُ الْمُرَكَّبُ الْمُفِيدُ بِالْوَدْعِ is the beginning of the Ajrumiyya. It's a very famous treatise on grammar. Speech is uttered, it's compounded, it's mufid, it's useful, it has meaning, and it is used by the Arabs bil-wad'i. It is placed by an Arab placement. The Arabs are using it and it's recognized. Right? So Arabs are using the word Injil. Right? It comes from Evangelion, Greek word made Arabic. The word ghassaq is Turkish. Illa hamima wa ghassaqa, it says in the Quran. Surah An-Naba, ghassaq, Turkish. The word durriyun, kawkabun durriyun, ayatun nur. Durriyun is Ethiopic. It's another Semitic language spoken in Ethiopia, Al-Habasha. And Kawkab, the word before Kawkav is Hebrew. Right? And then Sijil is Persian. Sijil. Tarmihim bihijaratin min Sijil. Sangogel. Sangogel became Sijil. There's no G, there's no G, right? In Arabic, unless you live in Egypt. Then there's a G, right? And people like to watch the show Gay Leno. Anyway, sorry, bad joke. But they say Gamal, Gamil, that's the Jamil, right? It's Arabic, Egyptian lahja, right? But Sangogel became Sijil. It's like a stone made of mud, right? And then there's Hebrew words, a lot of Sinin, Musa, Nuh, Ibrahim. There's Syriac. Syriac is a language of Isa alayhi salam. The word Tur, mountain, is Syriac, Suryaniya. So you have these different languages. You have these different words in the Quran that in their etymology are foreign, but since the Arabs are using them, they're considered to be Arabic. Okay, let's talk about the themes of the Quran. According to Imam al-Ghazali and others, Imam al-Biqa'i and many others, there are about 7 different thematic types of ayat in the Quran. Every ayah of the Quran falls into one of these types, one of these thematic types. The first is called qasas. Qasas means narrative. Qasas, right? A qissa means a story. So, for example, the nativity of Isa alayhi salam. وَإِذْ قَالَتِ الْمَلَائِكَةُ يَا مَرْيَمُ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُبَشِّرُكِ بِكَلِمَةٍ مِّنْهُ اسْمُهُ الْمَسِيحُ. Right? The story of the past. So the flood, the Exodus, the Ashab al-Kahf, the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. These are all qisas. These are all narrative. Also references to events in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, like the Battle of Khandaq, Laylatul Isra wal Mi'raj, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. This all falls under the thematic category of qissa or qisas, narrative. And then you have another type of ayah, which is called hukum. The plural is ahkam. So this deals with some sort of legal ruling or judgment, right? Ahkam. So you have ahkam badaniya. You have rulings that deal with the body. So like ayat that deal with fasting, or ablutions, or penal punishments. Right? وَالسَّارِقُ وَالسَّارِقَةُ فَاقْطَعُوا أَيْدِيَهُمَا, what to do with the thief. إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَاغْسِلُوا وَجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ. When you stand to pray, wash your face, wash your hands to the elbows. Right? So these are called ahkam badaniya. So these fall under the category of ahkam. So again, there's 7 thematic categories of ayat. The first is called narrative. Now we have ahkam. Within ahkam, there are different categories. Ahkam badaniya. Then you have ahkam qalbiya or khuluqiyya. So rulings or imperatives or injunctions that deal with ethics or spirituality. For example, i'dilu wa aqrabu lit-taqwa. Be just. It is the closest thing to piety. Be just. Right? And there's many types of these types of ayat. Or in Surah Al-Isra, ayat 32, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا إِنَّهُ كَانَ فَاحِشَةً وَسَاءَ سَبِيلًا. Don't even come close to zina. Right? Notice the wording. وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا قَرِيب. Don't even come close to fornication. So the Quran doesn't say don't fornicate. It says don't even put yourself in a position where that can actually be possible. Right? So like you're not allowed to be in a room with a non-mahram that's locked or that's closed. There has to be sort of a fear of being discovered. Right? So most incidents of zina in our culture, in American culture, they originate in the workplace. You know, a man and a woman going out to lunch. Hey, it's just lunch. What's the problem? Right? No big deal. They go and they talk and they get to know each other. Or I'm going out to the movies with my friend's wife. What? What are you talking about? Yeah, he's out of town. I'm going to take her out to the movies. What? And when we question these things, they think we're so strange. They think we're weird, right? I mean, you don't do that? No. I don't even shake hands with a non-Muslim. What are you talking about? They think that's okay if they think you're strange. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Inna dina bada'a ghariban, fasayaudu kama bada'a fatuba lil ghuraba." This religion began strange; it will return to strange. Glad tidings to the strangers. Glad tidings. Every week they would come to my cubicle when I worked in the corporate world. They say, "Hey, Ali, are you going to happy hour?" Happy hour is when they go out and get drunk on Friday afternoon. Every week. And I said, "No, I don't drink." "Wow, man, that's strange. Just come and listen. Just come and be with us." I said, "No, I'm not even going to. I don't feel comfortable." "Really? You're strange, man. That's too strange. You're an extremist." That's what I said. You don't drink alcohol is extreme. Nowadays, like praying 5 times a day for a lot of parents is extreme. Like a youth who wants to pray for, that's, you're going to become wallah, and God knows. And I'm just praying. No, it's too extreme. Get your degree first. Degree? I have to get my degree to pray 5 times a day? This is what I hear from people. My mom won't let me pray. She wants me to get my degree first. I see your parents have a good intention, obviously. They're very concerned about, you sort of going down the wrong path, but praying is the right path, obviously. Praying is right. So that's okay. Okay. And then you have ahkam that deal with ibadah. Ahkam ubudiyya. Things dealing with prayer, right? And then ahkam maliyya. Legal injunctions dealing with what to do with wealth. So that's the second thematic category, is ahkam, rulings. And of course you also have do's and don'ts. These fall under the category of the ahkam. Prescriptions and proscriptions. A prescription is you have to do this. A proscription is do not do this. And people think the entire Quran is a book of do's and don'ts. Less than 600 ayat out of 6,200 deal with do's and don'ts. And most of those 600 are actually commentaries on the do's and don'ts. just a few dozen ayat of the Quran deal with do's and don'ts. Right? So the Quran is not a purely deontological book, do and don't. That's not what it is. By far, the most prevalent theme of the Quran is qasas, is narrative. It's just stories repeated over and over again. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to think about these stories and to draw out lessons and how to make them relevant for our times. Right? And then the third theme is rububiyyah, theological type verses. Rububiyyah. Right? So like Surah Al-Ikhlas, that entire surah would fall under the thematic category of rububiyyah. So ayat that deal with the essence, the sifat, the qualities or attributes, and af'al, actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the fourth type of ayat is called prophetological, nabawiyya. For example, Surah Al-Ahzab, ayat number 6, An-Nabiyyu awla bil-mu'minina min anfusihim. The Prophet takes precedence for the believers than their own selves. Right? And you might have one ayah that contains 3 or 4 of these elements. But every ayah at least can fall into one of these categories. At least one of these categories. According to Imam Ghazali. Then you have number 5 is called promise, wa'ad, and number 6 is called wa'id, threat, promise and threat. Wa'ad and wa'id, promise and threat. So oftentimes in the Quran you have what's known as tibaq, which is a juxtaposition of ideas. You have a promise of Jannah, and immediately you have a threat of the nar. Right? There's a story of the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba were praying behind him, and they saw him during the prayer, lean in and put his hand out during the prayer, and then suddenly withdraw his hand. So they asked him after about that, and he said, I was reciting ayat describing Jannah, right? And I was suddenly given a vision of some of the low-hanging fruits of Jannah. I reached my hand out. And then the Quran has tibaq. So when you keep reading, suddenly there's a threat of nar, of the fire. So when he got to those ayat, he had a vision of the fire and he withdrew his hand. Wa'ad and wa'id, promise and threat. Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar. Indeed, we have given you kawthar. This is a wa'ad, a promise. وَعَدَ اللَّهِ حَقٍّ وَمَنْ أَصْدَقُ مِنَ اللَّهِ قِيلًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He makes a promise, He says Himself, He will never break His promise. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ. The believers will gain salvation. This is a promise, and Allah will never break His promise. A wa'id is a threat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Tawbah, ayah 24, we talked about the nature of Surah Tawbah, that if any of these material things are more beloved to you, and he mentions like your wealth and your houses and your possessions, any of these, your families, any of these things, أَحَبَّ إِلَيْكُم مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ وَجِهَادٍ فِي سَبِيلِهِ فَتَرَبَّصُوا حَتَّى يَأْتِيَ اللَّهُ بِأَمْرِهِ. If any of those things are more beloved to you than Allah, His Messenger, and struggling in the cause of Allah, which has a martial aspect as well as an internal aspect, then just wait until Allah brings about His decision. In other words, you don't want to wait. This is a threat from Allah. When Allah issues a threat, we should take it seriously. If a human being calls your house and issues you a threat, you're not going to sleep all night. You're going to call the cops, you're going to move out, you're going to take it seriously. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala threatens, we take it seriously. However, we know from our theology that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so merciful that He may forego a threat. And this is something that is in the theology of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The Mu'tazila, the rationalists, they claim that every single threat that Allah makes, He must carry out. Right? So the problem with that type of theology is that they're circumscribing or they're limiting Allah's volition and agency and mercy. If Allah breaks a threat, that's a demonstration of His mercy. Breaking a promise is khiyana. Breaking a promise is considered treachery. Right? Did I talk about this last time? Oh, I talked about this. I was in Australia. Similar setup. So, for example, if there's a king who has who's made a law in his land that if you kill any of the sheep of my kingdom, I'll hang you. Right? So they caught this little boy killing sheep. So they bring him to the king. Right? So the king says, well, the law says I have to hang you, so go hang him. Right? That's the letter of the law. Or the king could say, why are you stealing? And the kid said, well, my family's poor. So the king says, okay, that's okay. Here, take some more sheep. Right? So that's a function of the king's mercy. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can forego a threat. He can forego a threat. But we don't lean on that assurance. There's no assurance Allah will do that for any of us. It's mumkin. It's just conceivable Allah can do that. Right? That's why we have to be between hope and fear. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, wear the two sandals of hope and fear. Right? So hope is called raja. Raja. Raja means hope with work. It doesn't mean just fear without work, hope without work. That's called tamanna. There's a hadith, al-kayyisu man dana nafsahu wa amila lima ba'da al-maut wa la'ajizu man atba'a nafsaha hawaha wa tamanna ala Allah. The intelligent one is the one who subdues his lower self and works for what comes after death. The unintelligent one is the one who puts his nafs in pursuance of its desires and just has vain hope in God. Oh, I hope I go to Jannah, and he doesn't pray. Right? I told his brother one time, way back in the college days, we're praying Salatul Jummah, like right outside where this brother was, and he's Muslim. We said, you want to pray with us? And he said, Inna Allah ghafurur rahim. God He's merciful and forgiving. We said, yeah, that's true. That's true. He's merciful and forgiving. Right? It's like when Shaitan came to Isa alayhi salam and said, Qul la ilaha illallah. And then Isa alayhi salam said, that's true, but I'm not going to repeat it because you told me to say it. It's a true statement. So I said, Inna Allah shadidul iqab. Sari'ul hisab. Allah is also severe in retribution. So, tamanna is just, like someone who's sitting in his mother's basement at 40 years old, and his mom says, go get a job. If it happens, it happens, man. I hope I can become a doctor one day. He just played video games, wearing his flip-flops, eating Cheetos. So raja means to have hope coupled with strong effort. This is called raja, and there's tawfiq in that. Tamanna is to have hope with no effort, and there's no tawfiq. Khidlan is forsakenness in that. So be between hope and fear. Khawf. So not too much hope, right? That you start to become arrogant, right? And then you start becoming lax on your amal. Like some Christians, they say, I have assurance of paradise. I'm assured paradise. Many Christians have said to me, do you have assurance of paradise in Islam? And I said, the Prophet ﷺ said, Man qala la ilaha illallah bi sidqin dakhala jannah. Whoever says la ilaha illallah with sincerity will enter paradise. So inshallah, I am that person who will say la ilaha illallah with sidq. And he said, no, that's not good enough. You have a personal assurance. Personal. You mean, is there a hadith where the Prophet says, Ali Ataie will yadkhulul jannah? No, I don't have such personal assurance. Personal assurance is dangerous because it makes one lazy. If you're assured paradise, 100% that's going to happen, then you start becoming lax on your a'mal. That's a problem. Then you have the other extreme where people are full of fear, right? So they get into a state of qunut. Qunut means despair. Like, what's the point? You know how dirty my nafs are? How can God even forgive me? This type of mentality. La taqnatu min rahmatillah. Do never despair of God's mercy. You have to be between the two. Right? And nowadays, the ulama say, lean a little bit on the side of hope. Have a little more hope nowadays. Because there's so much doom and gloom and, fire and brimstone. Okay, so wa'ad and wa'id. And then the last thematic category is called ma'ad, or the hereafter. The hereafter. So any ayah of the Qur'an will fall into at least one of these 7 categories. Of qisas, of narrative, of judgment or ruling, of theology, of prophetology, promise, threat, and ma'ad, hereafter. So if you look at juz amma, the last juz, the central theme of the last juz is ma'ad. Right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is training Muslims. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't begin by revealing all these ahkam. Right? Those came in Medina, actually. You could be the town drunk in Mecca and be Muslim. And there's nothing wrong with drinking alcohol. After the Battle of Badr, some of the Sahaba, they had a party and they got drunk. It's mentioned in Surah. Because there was no prohibition of alcohol at the time. Right? So these things came later. So when we're implementing the religion, we have to keep these things in mind. We don't suddenly, expect people to adopt all of these ahkam and sunnah. They should be encouraged, right? But I've seen people become Muslim and then leave the religion shortly thereafter because they find it burdensome. It's not burdensome, but it has to be taken in dosages. So our mother Aisha, she said, if prohibition, meaning non-allowance to drink alcohol, was revealed initially, then very few people would have become Muslim. There's a statement attributed to her along those lines. So we have ma'ad. And then the final verse of the Quran revealed, according to Imam Suyuti, is Al-Baqarah 281. This is the final verse of the Quran. It's not Al-Yawma Akmaltu Lakum Dinakum. That's not the final ayah. That was revealed Hajjatul Wada. Many ayat that came after. Some of the ulama say there are no ahkam that came after this ayah. But the final verse, absolute final, is Surah number 2, verse 281. وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ. Fear the day that you will be returned to Allah. So the Quran comes full circle. Ma'ad back to ma'ad. Okay. Any questions so far before we talk? Yes, sir.
In terms of tafsir of the Quran, and even in terms of translation, there seems to be difference in Aqidah in terms of Ash'ari and Maturidi, in terms of who can interpret the Quran and how there's a relationship. Can you clarify, what are the main differences between the two, or if they're even
Yeah, the traditional definition of a Sunni Muslim is someone who follows the 4 schools of thought, one of the 4 madhahib. Although most ulama would say that there is allowance for mixing them as well. And then also following one of the 2 schools of classical theology, which are Ash'ari, Maturidi, and some include the Ataie, or the early Hanbali school as well. Imam Tahawi's creed is Ataie, right? It's non-speculative, it's very ecumenical. The differences between Ash'ari and Maturidi, the ulama of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah will say, are negligible. They're not major. What to do with really the difference. One of the major differences, and it's again not a major difference, one of the noteworthy differences is the role of the intellect. So for the Ash'ari, the intellect really has to be aided by revelation to arrive at true theology. For the Ash'ari, in other words, the intellect left by itself will not arrive at Tawheed. It must be aided by revelation. But as Maturidi will say, it is possible It's possible for the intellect to arrive at Tawheed without revelation. Right? But parents and society will compromise the fitrah, compromise the aql. There's a hadith that says, "Kullu mawludin yuladu ala al-fitrah." Every child is born upon a pure state, an innate disposition to accept the message of the prophets. And parents and society make that child a Jew, a Christian, a Zoroastrian, an atheist. Right? And then with the Ash'ari, there tends to be more tendency to make ta'wil of ayat, so interpretation of ayat that are mutashabihat, ayat that are not clear in meaning, right? So a little more speculative. And that's sort of the critique from the Hanabila or the Ataie about the Ash'ari, is that it's too speculative. Of course, the Mu'tazila theology is way too speculative, and it's not even considered a permissible position theologically. But some of the Ash'ari believe that it was necessary to engage in ilm al-kalam, speculative theology or polemical theology, because you have these other groups, saying these very strange things about the Qur'an. Right? For example, Yadullahi fawqa aydihim, the hand of God. What is that? Some groups said that means a physical hand made of matter, that Allah is located in space, He's sitting on a physical throne. So the Ash'aris, they had to clarify what that means. Yadullah means the power of God, right? According to those who make ta'wil, right? So this is called ta'wil. Wallahu a'lam. Yes?
So why were the non-Arabic names, especially like Ibrahim, Musa, Injil, Torah, popular in Arabic language? Because it's largely a paganistic society. So why were they borrowing these words from monotheists?
Yeah, by and large, the Arabs of Mecca were mushrikeen, but there seems to have been some influence from Ahlul Kitab. And nowadays, scholars would say that there was probably more influence than we previously thought. In the Quran, it's interesting, in a Meccan surah, there's an ayah that says that the mushrikeen came to the Prophet ﷺ, and they said to him, why don't you receive a revelation like Moses did? This is coming from pagan Arabs. So there was some familiarity amongst the Quraysh, the mushrikeen of the Quraysh, as to the nature of prophecy. And of course you have the Hunafa. You have a group of Arabs in Mecca, pre-Islamic Arabia in Mecca, that did not engage in shirk because they claimed to be in the tradition of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So they're very conscious of their Abrahamic heritage, right? And obviously there are Arab Christians that don't necessarily live in Mecca, but live in the south and north that pass through Mecca. You have Jewish tribes living in the north, in Khaybar and Yathrib, and other places that would pass through Mecca as well. So these names were established amongst them at the time. The Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula, it's interesting, they didn't use Yeshua for Isa. Arabs in other, like maybe in Iraq, were using Yeshua, but Arabs in Mecca were using Isa. So that's what the Quran uses. The Quran was revealed in the dialect of the Quraysh. Right? The Quran was revealed in the dialect of the Quraysh. We'll talk about this more. We talk about the 7 ahruf, ala sab'ati ahruf. There's a hadith that says, in this hadith in Bukhari, 10 companions related to hadith. The Quran was revealed upon 7 letters. What are these letters? These ahruf. One opinion is these are 7 different dialects of Arabic. Like Qurayshi and Hudayli and the Thaqifi and others. The dominant opinion is that no, they're not 7 dialects. The Quran is revealed in the Qurayshi dialect, but there's 7 types of variations of the text. 7 types of variations of the text. So one type of variation is variations of the skeletal dots. You have a reading. وَيُعَلِّمُهُ الْكِتَابِ. Allah will teach Isa the book. In another qira'ah, وَنُعَلِّمُهُ الْكِتَابِ. We will teach him the book. You and Nu both are multiply attested tawatur. Right? So this is a function of the ahruf. Or you have variations in diacritical vowel notations. For example, and we'll get into this later, I'm sort of going on a tangent, but the verse on the wudu, وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ. Right? This is, means, and wipe your heads and wash your feet to the ankles. Because arjulakum with a fatha means it's mansub, it's accusative. So it's not referring to the closest verb, which means wipe. You have to go to the next closest verb, which is ghasala, to wash. However, there's another reading of this ayah where it says arjulikum, genitive, kasra, which now goes back to the wipe. And Sunnis, they take from all these qira'at, right? There's 7 or something 10 qira'at of the Qur'an. So the general rule is to wash to the ankle. But if you're wearing socks that are above the ankle, then there's dispensation to wipe over the khuf. The Shia, they only take the genitive reading. So they'll wipe over the barefoot. This is really the issue with praying behind them. There are some differences in Aqidah. They believe in 12 infallible imams, right? The Ithna Ashariya, right? We believe in those imams. They were great men. But Isma is only for Al-Anbiya, so it's a mistaken belief. But it doesn't give kufr. The main issue is they don't wash their feet to the ankle. So there's a problem shar'an with their prayer. That's why the ulama say makruh tahriman, makruh tanzihan, to pray behind a Shi'i. Not necessarily for a theological reason. Although some of the ulama also mentioned that their opinions of certain Sahaba do give kufr. For example, anyone who maintains the ifk about Aisha, right? And if you read their books, some of them actually maintain that, unfortunately. So that's going against Dalil Qati'i. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, He says in the Quran, يُعِيدُكُمُ اللَّهُ أَن تَعُودُوا لِمِثْلِهِ أَبَدًا إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. Allah exhorts you never ever to say anything remotely close to this about Aisha ever again, if you are believers. Okay? So, some of the ulama, unfortunately, they maintain the ifk. I don't know how you deal with that ayah, to be honest with you. But something like that is clearly kufr. Anyway. Okay, anyone? Yes?
You mentioned the language Syriac. Is that an ancient language which is not existing anymore?
Yeah, it's considered a dead language. There are some remote villages in Sham to this day where they speak the language, day to day. But other than that, and then the Church of the East, there's a church in Iraq called the Assyrian Church, also called the Church of the East. Their church liturgy is conducted in Syriac, but they speak Arabic. So they don't speak it as a spoken language. But in church, their church liturgy is conducted in Syriac. But basically, it's like Sanskrit. It's a dead language. Akkadian, Ugaritic, these are all Semitic languages that are now dead. Nobody really speaks them anymore. Even Hebrew was a dead language for a while. They revived it by looking at Arabic. There's a statement Imam al-Haddad mentions that in the Lives of Man, he says, on the Day of Judgment, the language of Yom al-Qiyamah is Suryaniya, is in Syriac. The proceedings on the Yom al-Qiyamah are in Syriac. Allahu A'lam. The language of Isa alayhi salam. The language of Jannah is Arabic. And it's okay if you don't know Arabic. You should try to learn it, but you'll be initiated into the language, inshallah. All of us, inshallah. But we should learn it. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, Syriac is also called late Aramaic. Late Aramaic. It was a language of Isa alayhi salam. His spoken language. Okay, let's begin talking about the transmission of the Quranic revelation. So the Quran has been transmitted to us in two ways, orally and in written form. So on page 18 of Von Denffer's text, Ibn Hisham relates. Ibn Hisham is a great historiographer. He wrote the Surah and Nabawiyah, 3 volumes of the Prophet ﷺ. He mentions that early in the Meccan period, you have reports of Sahaba reciting Qur'an at the Kaaba. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, the first of the Sahaba to go recite in public, and he was beaten, right? Abu Dhar al-Ghifari recited Qur'an at the Kaaba, he was beaten. Of course, the Prophet ﷺ would go, he recite, they put him in a chokehold, they throw garbage on him, right? They also mentioned Abu Bakr as-Siddiq would recite the Qur'an at his house, and the mushrikeen, some of them used to come and hide behind his fence just to listen, right? So the Qur'an is very sweet. If you know Arabic well, it's mesmerizing. So you have Abu Sufyan and others would come, and it must have been a very awkward moment when they'd go there and there's other mushrikeen there. Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? I'm just relaxing. And they're actually listening to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq's recitation. So the argument is then, why didn't they just become Muslim then? The reason is because, it's beyond aesthetics. It's not just, this is so beautiful, I should become Muslim. That's the mistake Muslims make when they deal with that tahaddi. As we said, the challenge of the Quran is not just make something as beautiful as the Quran. The reason why these people didn't become Muslim, Abu Sufyan did become Muslim, but not until later. But Abu Jahl never became Muslim. Is because the Quran is calling towards a morality that's coming into conflict with their own nafs. So that's first and foremost what the Quran is doing, right? So it doesn't matter how beautiful it is, if a person doesn't want to change, they're not going to convert. Okay. There's a hadith in Bukhari, خيركم من تعلم القرآن وعلمه. The best amongst you are those who learn the Qur'an and teach it. Another hadith in Muslim, Al-Qur'anu hujjatun lak aw alayk. The Qur'an is either a proof for you or against you on the Yawm al-Qiyamah. Recital of the Qur'an is required, obviously, in the 5 daily prayers. Thus, the Qur'an was constantly heard and recited and memorized by the Sahaba. Right? So, this is important. The Qur'an that we recite was recited by Sahaba. The New Testament that Christians read today, the Gospel of Matthew, for example, was never seen by Isa alayhi salam. The Gospel of Mark was never seen by Isa alayhi salam. The Gospel of John, the Gospel of Luke, the 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, the book of Romans, the book of Revelation, none of the 27 books of the New Testament, the so-called Injil, were ever even seen by Isa alayhi salam. They were written after his life. Right? But the Qur'an we recite today was recited by Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ. We actually know which surah he would recite at specific prayers. Our mother Aisha said that the Prophet ﷺ would pray the 2 sunnah before the fard of subh in the morning. He would recite al-kafirun in the first rak'ah and ikhlas in the second. And it was very, he was very, what's the word? Consistent in doing that. For sunnah prayers, you can have some consistency, but for fard, you shouldn't. For fard prayers, you shouldn't designate I'm going to recite this in every fard prayer. It's makruh in the Hanafi school. Although there is a report of man, the Prophet ﷺ, he put him in charge of a group of Muslims to go out for an expedition. And this man would every rak'ah would recite ikhlas. Even when he would recite another surah, he would do ikhlas after. So they complained to the Prophet ﷺ and said, he's always reciting ikhlas, every rak'ah, ikhlas, ikhlas. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said to him, why do you recite the surah in every rak'ah? And he said, ask him why he does that. Ask him why he does that. So they asked, why do you do that? And he says, I just love how Allah is described in this surah. So they came back and he said, his answer was, he loves how Allah is described in the surah. And then the Prophet said, tell him Allah loves him. So ikhlas is weighty. And then like Salatul Jum'ah, they said there was some consistency with Salatul Jum'ah, Salatul A'la, and then Al-Ghashiyah in the second. 87 and 88. So we know which and then in Fajr prayer, the Fard, he would recite longer ayat, right? It would be a longer prayer. In Maghrib it was shorter. We actually know this from the hadith literature. So it's extraordinary that we know this. So the Sahaba were constantly hearing and reciting and memorizing the Qur'an. Now, this was an oral culture. It was, or an auditory. It was sama'iyun. So most people were illiterate. They didn't know how to read or write. In fact, most pre-modern cultures were oral. Even in Athens, in the 5th century before the Common Era, the time of Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, 90% of the general populace did not know how to read or write. In fact, Socrates himself was illiterate. That's why he never wrote anything. Everything we know about Socrates is through Plato. Right? So this was normal. Everything was oral. So the Arabs actually excelled at poetry and at memorization. This is something they excelled at. It was the height of their language. The time of the Quranic revelation, it was the height of Arabic. And they excelled in hifz, in memorization. So it's almost as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is preparing them for the Qur'an and the Sunnah. They would memorize their lineage back to Ibrahim alayhi salam. They would memorize their horses' lineages. The horses. This horse is the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. All the way back, generations for horses. Right? So this was something that was very important for them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala facilitated the preservation of the Sunnah and the Qur'an by giving it primarily, first and foremost, to the Arab. There are still oral cultures in the world. One of my colleagues went to Mauritania, West Africa, and he was 18 at the time, and he said that the children were laughing at him because he was not a hafiz of Qur'an, and he was so old. So what did you do with your life? You're 18, you're not hafiz yet? Right? So in oral culture, memorization was something that was valued. There are people who have the entire Arabic dictionary, the Qamus, memorized. The people who have the Shama'il and Nabawiyah of Tirmidhi memorized, page numbers and everything. So the Muslim argument is that the order and arrangement was well known. The order and arrangement of the Qur'an was well known because of the constant recitation of the Qur'an by the Sahaba. So that's an important point to make. The Prophet ﷺ also listened to the recitation of the Qur'an by his companions. On page 18 of Denffer, there's a hadith of Bukhari, where the Prophet ﷺ says to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who was known for his Quranic skills, he said, "Iqra alayya, recite the Qur'an to me." And Ibn Mas'ud said, "How can I recite it to you when it was revealed to you?" And he said, "I love to hear it from somebody else other than me." So Ibn Mas'ud began reciting Surah An-Nisa, and he got to verse 41. وَكَيْفَ إِذَا جِئْنَا مِنْ كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ بِشَهِيدٍ وَجِئْنَا بِكَ عَلَى هَؤُلَاءِ شَهِيدٍ. How will it be when we appoint a witness against every people, and we'll appoint you as a witness against this people? And then the Prophet says, "Okay, you can stop there." And Ibn Mas'ud looked, and there was tears streaming down the face of the Prophet. So there's evidence that Sahaba would recite the Quran to the Prophet. The Prophet also sent teachers to teach the Quran. Ibn Hisham relates to the Prophet ﷺ. He sent Mus'ab ibn Umair to the people of Yathrib before the Hijrah to Medina to recite the Quran to them and to teach them the Quran. And they called him Al-Qari, the reciter, the reader. Imam Suyuti mentions in the Itqan over 20 well-known companions who were Hufaz of the Qur'an. These include the 4 caliphs, Ibn Mas'ud, Ibn Abbas, Abu Huraira, Ibn Hajar, he mentions over 40 names. He names them. Oh, I think there's a. Oh,
Dr. said,
okay, next time we'll continue with the transmission of the Quran and the Uthmani Codex, inshallah. Sallallahu alaihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.